If you've never watched a man try to convince an egg to become an omelette through pure diplomatic negotiation, you've missed Fritz Brenner conducting breakfast diplomacy at its finest. He was at the stove, engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical discussion with our morning eggs when the doorbell rang, and since I happened to be passing through the hall with my second cup of coffee, the honor fell to me. It was 9:15 on a Tuesday morning in June, one of those rare days when New York decides to behave itself and pretend it's a civilized place to live. On the front stoop, I found no petitioner with a sob story, no insurance salesman with a death wish, and, thank whatever gods watch over private detectives, no newspaper reporter with a notebook and an attitude. Just a manila envelope sitting on the top step like a well-trained cat that had been left for adoption. The address was printed in block letters that looked like they'd been typed by someone wearing mittens. Nero Wolfe, with our West 35th Street address below it. No return address, no postmark, no clue as to where it had come from or who had the nerve to leave anonymous mail on our doorstep. I picked it up and felt the weight of something substantial inside, either money, a manuscript, or the world's flattest sandwich. Back in the office, I slit it open with my letter opener and found 3 items that made my morning considerably more interesting. A cashier's check for $1,000 made out to bearer, a glossy magazine photograph that had been clipped with surgical precision, and a blue index card with 7 names typed in neat, single-spaced lines. The check was drawn on something called the Amaranth Trust, signed by an assistant treasurer whose signature looked like it had been designed by committee. $1,000 to bearer meant whoever held it could cash it, which would have appealed to a less scrupulous man than myself, though I'll admit the thought crossed my mind briefly. Fritz appeared in the doorway with a wooden spoon in his hand and the expression of a man whose carefully planned morning was being threatened by uncertainty. Archie, should I prepare for additional guests at lunch, or will it be just the 2 of us while Mr. Wolfe communes with his orchids? Plan for 2 as usual, I told him. Wolfe won't be down from the plant rooms until 11, and by then we'll know whether this envelope contains an invitation to easy money or a one-way ticket to trouble. He nodded and withdrew, satisfied that his culinary world remained properly ordered. I turned my attention back to the mysterious delivery. The photograph showed 5 people seated around a conference table, and not one of them looked like they were having a good time. The table was covered with papers, an ashtray containing the remains of what had been a long meeting, and a water pitcher that nobody seemed inclined to trust. The photo had been trimmed with the precision of a surgeon, too precisely, in fact. The right edge cut off part of a man's shoulder and just the hint of what might have been a lapel pin, while the bottom had been cropped to remove what was probably a caption. One of the women in the photo had the kind of short, no-nonsense haircut that suggested she could end arguments with a look. The man beside her wore his collar like he believed it was holding up the world. The other 3 had the glazed expressions of people who'd been in meetings too long and were beginning to question their life choices. The blue index card contained 7 names, typed without titles or explanations. Owen Vance, Delia Ziegler, Miriam Lyle, Carlton Baird, Nina Pape, Vera Conti, Franklin Wheat. No Mr. or Ms., no job descriptions, no indication of whether these were saints, sinners, or something in between. I flipped the photograph over and found part of an advertisement for something called The Plain Sight Conversations, What We Don't See When We. Look, a lecture series sponsored by the Amaranth Trust, scheduled for Thursdays at 8. The phrase plain sight was underlined in red ink, as if someone wanted to make sure I didn't miss the irony. At 9:20, the house operates under the jurisdiction of 30,000 orchids and Theodore Horstman upstairs. Wolfe spends his mornings from 9 to 11 in the plant rooms, and during those hours, he's about as accessible as the Pope during Easter Mass. I considered climbing 4 flights to wave the check under his nose and decided I valued my continued employment. Instead, I made myself comfortable at my desk and studied the photograph more carefully. The lighting suggested it had been taken in an office or conference room, probably during daylight hours. The papers on the table looked official, the kind of documents that come with government seals or corporate letterheads. Most interesting was that clipped edge where someone had carefully removed what might have been identifying information, leaving just the hint of a lapel pin that looked like it might have been circular with some kind of design inside. The names on the card I copied onto a fresh sheet of paper, leaving space beside each one for notes. 7 people, all presumably connected to whatever had been happening in that photograph. 7 potential suspects, witnesses, or victims, depending on what kind of game we were being invited to play. At 10 minutes to 11, I cleared my desk of everything except the envelope and its contents, arranging them where Wolfe would see them the moment he settled into his chair. He doesn't like surprises, but he likes anonymous $1,000 checks even less, and I wanted him to know exactly what kind of morning we were having. At precisely 11 o'clock, Nero Wolfe descended from his orchid rooms like a mountain, deciding to relocate. He moved across the office with the deliberate precision of a man who knows exactly where everything belongs, including himself. He lowered his 1/7 of a ton into the custom-built chair behind his desk, arranged himself with the care of a conductor preparing for a symphony, and allowed his gaze to fall upon the morning's mysterious delivery. "Ah," he said, which from Wolfe constitutes an entire conversation. His eyes took in the check, the photograph, and the list of names without his moving so much as a finger. "What manner of theatrical nonsense have you admitted to my office, Archie?" "The usual kind," I replied. "Anonymous money, mysterious photographs, and a list of names that could belong to anyone from choir members to cat burglars. Someone left it on our doorstep like a foundling, and since it came with a $1,000 check, I thought you might want to take a look before I used it to start the fireplace." He made a sound that might have been amusement or indigestion. With Wolfe, it's often hard to tell the difference. "The Amaranth Trust," he said, reading the check without touching it. "A name that suggests either botanical interests or classical pretensions. The photograph." I handed it to him, but he waved it away and pointed to the black wooden stand we use for displaying evidence when he's not in the mood to handle things directly. I set it up at the proper angle and distance. 3 years of working for Wolfe had taught me the precise geometry of his preferences. He studied the photograph for a full minute, his eyes moving across it with the methodical precision of a man reading a book in a foreign language. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and fixed me with a look that suggested the morning was about to become significantly more complicated. "Describe what you observe, Archie." 5 unhappy people around a conference table," I said. "Papers that look official, an ashtray that's seen heavy use, and a water pitcher nobody trusts. The photo's been trimmed with surgical precision. Someone removed whatever would have identified when and where it was taken. On the back, there's an ad for something called the Plain Sight Conversations, sponsored by our friends at the Amaranth Trust. And the 7 names? No titles, no explanations. Could be the board of directors of a charity or the membership list of a very exclusive criminal organization." Wolfe picked up the blue card and examined it as if the names might rearrange themselves under scrutiny. He set it down and looked at the corner of the photograph, where the careful cropping had left just a hint of what might have been a lapel pin. "We shall undoubtedly receive visitors before noon," he announced with the certainty of a man predicting sunrise. "Telepathy. Or did the orchids give you a tip? Logic, Archie. The anonymous delivery, the theatrical presentation, the carefully orchestrated mystery, these are the hallmarks of people who believe themselves clever. Such people rarely have the patience to wait for their cleverness to be appreciated." He was right, of course. At 11:12 exactly, the doorbell rang with the punctuality of fate keeping an appointment. I answered it to find a man in his 30s with sandy hair, a worried expression, and the kind of leather portfolio that suggested he worked with words for a living. He had the pale complexion of someone who spent more time under fluorescent lights than sunlight, and his tie looked like it had been chosen by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. "Good morning," he said, with a smile that asked permission to exist. "I'm Owen Vance. I believe you received a package this morning." Owen Vance, the first name on our mysterious list. I stepped back and gestured him inside, curious to see how Wolfe would handle our first visitor in what was clearly going to be a parade of the anxious and the guilty. "Mr. Wolfe is in his office," I told him as we walked down the hall. "Fair warning, he doesn't like theatrical presentations, anonymous deliveries, or people who think they're cleverer than they are." Vance's smile flickered but held. "I'm afraid this situation calls for a certain amount of discretion." "In my experience," I said, opening the office door, "discretion is usually just another word for we're in trouble and don't want anyone to know about it." Wolfe looked up from the morning paper as we entered, his expression suggesting that visitors at this hour ranked somewhere below root vegetables on his list of life's pleasures. Vance stopped just inside the doorway, clearly recognizing that he was in the presence of a man who could make or break his morning with a single word. "Mr. Wolfe," he began. "I'm Owen Vance, managing editor of Plainsight magazine. I believe you received our request for assistance." I received an anonymous envelope containing money and a photograph. Wolfe replied with the warmth of a January morning. If that constitutes a request for assistance, it was poorly phrased. Vance shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly debating how much truth he could afford to tell. "We're a quarterly publication, funded by the Amaranth Trust. We specialize in investigative journalism, stories that examine what people choose not to see or what they're encouraged to overlook. Hence the name," I observed. "Plain sight. Very clever." Wolfe's look suggested that my commentary was neither required nor appreciated. "Sit, Mr. Vance, and explain why you chose to approach me through anonymous subterfuge rather than a straightforward business proposition." Vance took the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk and set his portfolio on his knees like a shield. "Because, Mr. Wolfe, we believe someone is trying to destroy our magazine from the inside, and we're not sure who we can trust." End of section 1. The opening section establishes the classic Nero Wolfe formula. An unusual delivery disrupts the Brownstones' routine. Wolfe reluctantly takes interest due to the intellectual challenge and affront to proper procedure, and Archie provides the reader's connection through his witty, observational narration. The magazine setting provides the perfect intellectual stakes, truth versus deception in the world of journalism, while the anonymous approach and internal sabotage threaten the sanctuary of Wolfe's ordered world. The stage is set for a cerebral mystery that will unfold through verbal confrontations and logical deduction rather than physical action. Owen Vance opened his leather portfolio with the careful precision of a man handling evidence in a murder trial, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. He extracted a manila folder and set it on Wolfe's desk like an offering to an unpredictable deity. "Plainsight has been under attack for 6 weeks, he began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd rehearsed this speech but wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Not the kind of attack that makes headlines. No break-ins, no threats, no obvious sabotage. Something more insidious. Our stories are being corrupted from within." Wolfe's grunt suggested he found this explanation about as illuminating as a candle in a coal mine. "Specifics, Mr. Vance. 3 incidents, escalating in severity." Vance counted them off on his fingers like a prosecutor outlining charges. "First, our lead story on municipal contract fraud. We'd spent 4 months documenting kickbacks in the Parks Department. The night before we sent it to the printer, someone accessed our shared editorial folder and replaced our final draft with an earlier version that contained unverified allegations. If we'd published it, we would have faced libel suits that could have destroyed us." "But you caught it in time," I observed. "Barely." Our fact-checker noticed the discrepancy during her final review. We had to delay publication by 2 weeks while we verified every detail again. Vance's hands were trembling slightly. The second incident was worse. Someone leaked details of our investigation into a charity embezzlement scheme directly to the people we were investigating. Our primary source, a bookkeeper who'd been feeding us financial records, suddenly stopped returning our calls. We found out later that he'd been fired and blacklisted throughout the non-profit sector. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, a movement that suggested he was beginning to take this seriously. And the third incident. Last week, our current investigation involves a real estate development scheme that's displacing low-income tenants through fraudulent eviction proceedings. We have documented evidence, forged documents, bribed inspectors, intimidated tenants. The story was scheduled to run in our next issue. Vance swallowed hard. Yesterday morning, we discovered that someone had accessed our secure server and corrupted every file related to the investigation. Not deleted, corrupted. The data is still there, but it's been subtly altered. Names changed, dates shifted, dollar amounts modified. It would take weeks to verify which details are accurate and which have been tampered with. Professional work, I commented. Someone who knows exactly how to make evidence unreliable without making it obviously fake. Precisely. And Mr. Goodwin, these aren't random attacks. Someone with intimate knowledge of our editorial process, our security protocols, and our investigation methods is systematically undermining our work. Vance gestured toward the photograph still displayed on its stand. That picture was taken last Monday during our weekly editorial meeting. Everyone with access to our systems was in that room. Wolfe studied the photograph with renewed interest. The individuals present, from left to right, Vera Conte, our managing director. She handles budgets, personnel, and logistics. Miriam Lyle, our lead investigative reporter. She wrote the real estate story that was corrupted. Nina Pape, our art director. She has administrative access to our publishing systems. Carlton Baird, our legal counsel. He reviews every story before publication. And myself. Vance's voice dropped. The other two names on your list, Delia Ziegler and Franklin Wheat, weren't present for that particular meeting, but they both have the same level of system access. And the photographer, Wolfe inquired, indicating the carefully cropped edge of the image. A freelancer we use for events and promotional materials. Franklin Wheat arranged for him to document our editorial process for a grant application. His name is... The doorbell rang with the punctuality of an appointment with destiny. I answered it to find a woman who could have chaired a corporate board meeting and enjoyed every minute of it. Dark suit, sensible shoes, and the kind of haircut that suggested she could end arguments with a look. She carried a leather briefcase that was clearly the more expensive cousin of Vance's portfolio. Delia Ziegler, she announced without preamble, executive director of the Amaranth Trust. I believe Mr. Vance is here. He is, I replied, stepping aside. Though I should warn you, Mr. Wolfe doesn't appreciate unannounced visitors. Her smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. I'm sure he'll make an exception for the person who signs his checks. I led her to the office, where Vance looked like a man who'd just been caught stealing cookies. Wolfe regarded our new visitor with the expression of a man calculating the odds of rain during a picnic. Miss Ziegler, Vance began. I thought we agreed. We agreed that you would handle this matter discreetly, she interrupted, settling into the second red leather chair without invitation. Hiring a private detective hardly qualifies as discreet. I hired the best private detective, Vance corrected with a flash of backbone I hadn't expected. There's a difference. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Miss Ziegler, you enter my office and immediately establish your authority over Mr. Vance. You presume much. She had the grace to look slightly abashed. My apologies, Mr. Wolfe. The Amaranth Trust has a substantial investment in Plain Sight magazine, and these recent difficulties have us concerned. Difficulties Wolfe repeated, savoring the word like a wine that had turned. Mr. Vance describes systematic sabotage. You call it difficulties. The disparity is instructive. The Trust supports investigative journalism because we believe in transparency and accountability, Ziegler said, her tone suggesting she was reciting from a mission statement. But we also have fiduciary responsibilities. If plain sight cannot maintain basic security and editorial integrity, we may need to reconsider our funding. Ah, Wolfe steepled his fingers. The truth emerges. You are here not to support Mr. Vance's investigation, but to ensure it concludes in a manner favorable to your organization's interests. I'm here to ensure it concludes quickly and quietly, she replied. The longer this situation drags on, the more damage it does to everyone involved. I made a note in my pad, though what I was really noting was the way Vance's shoulders had tensed when Ziegler mentioned reconsidering their funding. Fear makes people do interesting things, and I had a feeling we were about to see some interesting behavior from the staff of Plain Sight magazine. Mr. Vance, Wolfe said, his gaze shifting between his two visitors. You have presented me with a case of intellectual sabotage. Miss Ziegler has presented me with a case of institutional pressure. I find myself curious about which problem requires more urgent attention. The sabotage, Vance said quickly. Without editorial integrity, we have nothing. The stability, Ziegler countered. Without funding, editorial integrity is an expensive luxury. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Finally, he looked up with an expression that suggested he'd reached a decision that would make everyone equally unhappy. I will accept your case, he announced. Both of your cases, as they appear to be inextricably linked. My fee will be $25,000, paid in advance. My methods will be my own, and my conclusions will be based solely on evidence and logic, not on institutional convenience or editorial preference. Ziegler's eyes widened. $25,000 for a case of internal office politics, for a case that threatens the integrity of an institution dedicated to exposing hidden truths, Wolfe corrected. The irony alone is worth the premium. And if your investigation reveals that the most expedient solution is to restructure the magazine's operations, Ziegler asked carefully. Then that is what I will recommend, Wolfe replied. Truth, Ms. Ziegler is not subject to editorial revision. Vance looked like a man watching his life's work being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Mr. Wolfe, surely the goal is to identify the saboteur and restore our security, not to provide justification for shutting us down. The goal, Mr. Vance, is to determine the truth. If that truth is inconvenient for your magazine, your funding organization, or your personal ambitions, that is not my concern. Wolfe gestured toward me. Archie will prepare the engagement agreement. You will both sign it, along with your commitment to provide complete access to your personnel, your files, and your systems. And if we refuse, Ziegler asked, then you will leave my office and resolve your difficulties through whatever means you deem appropriate, Wolfe replied. But you will not return with anonymous envelopes and theatrical presentations. The two of them exchanged a look that could have powered a small city. Finally, Ziegler nodded. Very well. I'll authorize the payment. Excellent. Wolfe turned to Vance. This afternoon you will arrange for your editorial board to visit my office. All of them. I wish to observe their interactions in a neutral environment. All of them? Vance looked alarmed. Mr. Wolfe, if the saboteur realizes we've hired outside help. The saboteur already knows, Wolfe interrupted. The anonymous envelope delivered to my door was not sent by a friend of your magazine, Mr. Vance. It was sent by someone who wanted me to become involved in your affairs. The question is why. As I showed them out, I caught Ziegler's arm at the front door. Just curious, what makes you so sure this can be resolved quickly and quietly? Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Because, Mr. Goodwin. Some problems are easier to eliminate than to solve. Back in the office, Wolfe was studying the photograph again, his thick fingers drumming silently on his desk. "Archie, what did you observe about our visitors?" "Vance is scared and desperate. Ziegler is controlled and calculating, and neither one of them is telling us everything they know." "Indeed. And the photograph?" I looked at it again, noting the careful cropping, the formal arrangement around the conference table, the serious expressions. Someone wanted us to see those 5 people, but not whoever was standing just outside the frame. The question is whether they were hiding a friend or an enemy. Or, Wolfe said quietly, whether the distinction matters. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that lunch would be served in 10 minutes, and Wolfe nodded his approval. The morning had brought us a case that promised to be both intellectually challenging and politically dangerous. Exactly the kind of problem that made Wolfe's eyes light up with anticipation. "One more thing," I said as we prepared to adjourn for lunch. "When you told them the saboteur already knows we're involved, how can you be sure?" Wolfe's smile was barely perceptible. "Because, Archie, whoever sent that envelope wanted me to take this case. And in my experience, people who manipulate others into doing their bidding rarely do so from altruistic motives. The brownstone had been disturbed, all right, and I had a feeling the disturbance was just beginning." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the office had acquired the tense atmosphere of a courtroom where everyone suspected they might be both judge and defendant. I'd arranged the chairs in a careful semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, close enough for intimidation, far enough apart to prevent whispered conspiracies. Fritz had retreated to his kitchen after delivering coffee service for 6, muttering something in French that probably translated to "journalists are worse than tax collectors." They arrived in the kind of staggered formation that suggested coordination while denying it. Owen Vance led the procession, clutching a fresh manila folder like a shield against whatever was about to happen. Behind him came the editorial board of Plain Sight magazine, each one radiating their own particular brand of professional anxiety. Vera Conte entered first, and if you've never seen a managing director survey a room for potential budget overruns, you've missed a masterclass in controlled suspicion. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a way that suggested she could chair a hostile takeover while balancing the quarterly reports. Her navy suit was expensive enough to intimidate and practical enough to survive a newsroom crisis. She took the chair closest to Wolfe's desk with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in any room. Miriam Lyle followed, moving with the restless energy of a reporter who'd rather be chasing a story than sitting in what she clearly considered a waste of time. She was lean and angular, with short-cropped hair that looked like she'd cut it herself with a pair of office scissors and more important things to worry about. Her leather satchel was scarred from years of being dragged through subway turnstiles and government buildings, and she carried it like a weapon. She chose the chair by the window, positioning herself where she could watch both Wolfe and the door. Nina Pape, the art director, floated in with the kind of studied casualness that only comes from years of making creative decisions under impossible deadlines. She was younger than the others, probably early 30s, with dark hair that had been convinced to behave professionally and clothes that suggested she understood color theory better than most people understood breathing. She carried a tablet and what looked like a vintage camera bag, settling into her chair with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. Carlton Baird arrived with the punctual precision of a man who billed by the hour and documented every minute. He was younger than I'd expected for a legal counsel, probably not much past 30, but he carried himself with the careful authority of someone who'd learned early that lawyers were expected to be older and more conservative than their actual years. His suit was charcoal gray and perfectly pressed, his tie was knotted with mathematical precision, and his briefcase looked like it could survive a nuclear audit. Franklin Wheat brought up the rear, and if the others were various species of urban predator, he was definitely the herbivore trying not to attract attention. He was a soft, round man in his 50s with thinning hair and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested he spent more time with grant applications than with people. His tweed jacket was rumpled in a way that looked deliberate, but probably wasn't, and he carried a leather satchel that had seen better decades. He took the remaining chair with an apologetic smile, as if he were sorry for existing. Wolfe surveyed his assembled guests with the expression of a botanist examining specimens that might or might not be poisonous. He'd positioned himself behind his desk like a judge preparing to hear testimony, and I could see each of them trying to gauge his mood and their prospects. "You are here," Wolfe began without preamble, "because someone among your number has been systematically corrupting the editorial integrity of Plain Sight magazine. I do not yet know who or why, but I intend to discover both." The silence that followed was thick enough to require a building permit. Vera Conti was the first to break it, her voice carrying the smooth professionalism of someone accustomed to managing crises before they became disasters. "Mr. Wolfe, I appreciate your directness, but we should consider that these incidents might have external causes. Disgruntled subjects of our investigations, corporate interests, even foreign actors. Journalism makes enemies. External actors do not possess administrative passwords to your editorial systems," Wolfe replied. "Nor do they attend your weekly meetings to learn which stories pose the greatest threat to their interests." Miriam Lyle leaned forward, her reporter's instincts clearly engaged. "You're saying someone in this room has been feeding information to our targets?" "I'm saying that the pattern of interference suggests intimate knowledge of your editorial process, your security protocols, and your investigative priorities," Wolfe corrected. "The identity of the interferer remains to be determined." Carlton Baird cleared his throat with the careful precision of a lawyer preparing to object. "Mr. Wolfe, accusations of professional misconduct carry serious legal implications. Without concrete evidence, Mr. Baird," Wolfe interrupted, "I'm not making accusations. I'm stating observations. The distinction is important, particularly for someone in your profession." Franklin Wheat had been tugging nervously at his earlobe, but now he spoke up in a voice that carried the slight tremor of someone unaccustomed to confrontation. "Perhaps we should consider whether these attacks are connected to our funding rather than our personnel. The Amaranth Trust has been increasingly involved in our editorial decisions." "How so?" I asked, noting the way Vera Conte's jaw tightened at the mention of editorial decisions. "They've requested more oversight," Franklin explained, his academic demeanor giving way to something sharper. "More consultation on story selection, more emphasis on constructive journalism rather than purely investigative work." Nina Pape looked up from her tablet with the expression of someone who just solved a design problem. "The attacks haven't just undermined our credibility. They've created a paper trail of editorial failures that could justify restructuring." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vera Conte glanced between the others like someone calculating the odds of surviving a conflict between natural forces. "That's a serious accusation," she said quietly. "Is it an accusation?" Wolfe asked, "or an observation?" Miriam Lyle's eyes had taken on the predatory gleam of a reporter scenting a story. "Delia Ziegler has been pushing for changes to our editorial process for months. More oversight, more collaboration with the Trust's board, more emphasis on stories that build rather than tear down." "Standard fiduciary oversight," Carlton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Or standard preparation for a takeover," Miriam countered. "I've seen it before. Gradual pressure to modify operations, followed by claims that the organization is no longer fulfilling its mission, followed by restructuring that eliminates the original purpose." Wolfe made a sound that might have been approval or indigestion. "Mr. Wheat, you arranged for the photographer who documented last week's editorial meeting. What was the stated purpose?" Grant renewal documentation, Wheat replied, his nervousness increasing. The trust requested visual evidence of our editorial process for their annual report. They wanted to show donors how their money supported serious journalism. And the photographer's name? Harvey Stoltz. He's worked with several trust grantees. Very professional, very discreet. Discreet enough to provide copies of his photographs to interested parties, I suggested. Wheat's face went pale. You think? No, that's impossible. Harvey's reputation... Mr. Wheat, Wolfe said gently, reputation is often the first casualty of financial pressure. Nina Pape had been sketching something while listening, but now she looked up with sudden understanding. The photograph sent to you was cropped to remove Harvey, wasn't it? Someone wanted you to see the five of us in that meeting, but not the photographer. Or the photography equipment, Miriam added. Professional lighting, cables, reflectors, all evidence that this was a staged documentation rather than a candid meeting. Vera Conte had been unusually quiet, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd been doing calculations. If someone has been systematically undermining our magazine to justify shutting it down, we're not dealing with simple sabotage. We're dealing with institutional fraud. Indeed, Wolfe agreed. The question is whether the fraud is being perpetrated by someone within your organization or against it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of people realizing that the ground beneath their feet might not be as solid as they'd assumed. Carlton Baird straightened in his chair, his legal training clearly engaged. If the trust has been orchestrating these attacks to justify eliminating funding, that would constitute breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, potentially criminal fraud. And if someone within the magazine has been sabotaging our work, Miriam added, that would be embezzlement, theft of intellectual property, and professional suicide. Franklin Wheat was rummaging through his leather satchel with increasing agitation. I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight with anxiety, but something's missing. What? Vance asked. A backup drive containing our financial records for the past 2 years. Trust policy requires duplicate records for all grant activities. Wheat's hands were shaking slightly. It was in my satchel when I arrived. It's not there now. The room erupted in questions and accusations, but Wolfe's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone will remain seated. Archie, please check the hallway. I found nothing in the hallway, but when I opened the front door, I discovered a small electronic device sitting on the top step, exactly where the morning's envelope had been placed. It was a USB drive, and attached to it was a note in the same block letters. Some truths hide in plain sight. When I returned with the drive, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to something approaching panic. Franklin looked like a man watching his career evaporate, while the others were eyeing each other with the wariness of poker players who suspected the deck was marked. Someone took Mr. Wheat's drive and placed it outside, I reported, with another anonymous message. Impossible, Vera said. We've all been here the entire time. Have we? Wolfe asked quietly. Mr. Baird, you excused yourself to use the facilities. Miss Pape, you stepped out to check on a delivery. Miss Lyle, you retrieved something from your car. The three of them looked at each other with expressions that could have powered a small war. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving from face to face with the methodical precision of a man reading a book in a language only he understood. The truth, he observed, is indeed hiding in plain sight. The question is whether we're prepared to see it when it reveals itself. He gestured toward me. Archie will need your complete cooperation. Server access logs, financial records, correspondence with the trust, and a detailed timeline of who had access to what information, when. Someone in this room knows more than they're admitting. Someone in this room has been playing a very dangerous game. As they filed out, each clutching their returned phones like lifelines, I caught the subtle glances they exchanged. the kind of looks that pass between people who share secrets they'd rather keep buried. The circle of suspects had been drawn. Now came the interesting part, discovering which one of them was the spider and which were merely caught in the web. Wolfe handed me my marching orders the next morning with the precision of a general deploying troops, which in his case meant settling deeper into his chair and speaking without once looking up from his morning paper. Archie, you will visit the offices of Plain Sight magazine. You will examine their technical systems with particular attention to access logs and security protocols. You will interview each member of their editorial board individually in their natural habitat, observing their reactions to scrutiny. You will determine who among them possesses the technical knowledge to execute these attacks and who possesses the motivation to do so. He turned a page with deliberate care. You will also speak with the photographer, Mr. Stoltz, and ascertain exactly who commissioned that carefully cropped image. Finally, you will return here with your observations, properly catalogued and ready for analysis. Any particular order of operations, or should I just follow my nose? Follow the evidence, Archie. It will lead you where logic requires you to go. The technical trail. The Plain Sight offices occupied the 5th floor of a converted factory building in the garment district, the kind of space that whispered serious journalism while shouting expensive rent. The reception area had exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and a young woman with silver hoop earrings who introduced herself as Kia and seemed to know exactly why I was there. "You're the detective," she said, not making it a question. "Owen's waiting for you, and Leo's got the server room ready. Fair warning, Leo speaks fluent computer, but his human needs work." Leo Kim turned out to be a compact man in his 30s with the kind of intense focus that comes from spending your days making machines behave properly. The server room was a converted closet with delusions of grandeur, 2 equipment racks, a wall-mounted air conditioning unit that worked overtime, and a whiteboard covered with network diagrams that looked like a subway map designed by someone having a nervous breakdown. "Here's what we know," Leo said, handing me a stack of printouts thick enough to stop a bullet. 3 incidents, 3 different attack vectors, but all requiring intimate knowledge of our systems and procedures. He walked me through the technical details with the patience of someone who'd explained computer forensics to lawyers before. The first incident, the Parks Department story rollback, showed evidence of someone using administrative privileges that shouldn't have existed. The system logs recorded the change as coming from Nina Pape's workstation, but not from her user account. The service account appears in the logs for exactly 3 minutes, Leo explained, pointing to the relevant entries. Then it vanishes like it never existed. That's not sloppy hacking, that's surgical precision. Physical access that night. Badge swipes show Carlton Baird entering at 10:41 p.m. Security cameras caught someone in a hooded jacket at 10:53. Average height, head down, impossible to identify. Motion sensors triggered in the conference room and Owen's office between 10:55 and 11:03. The second incident was more subtle. The charity embezzlement story had been leaked, but not through their email system. Someone had recreated the key points from legal review notes that Carlton had exported to send to outside counsel. The leak wasn't our internal file, Leo continued. Someone took Carlton's legal annotations and reverse-engineered our investigation from them. That requires understanding both our editorial process and legal review procedures. The third incident was the most sophisticated. The real estate investigation files had been corrupted in ways that preserved metadata while altering content. Names changed, dates shifted, dollar amounts modified, all designed to make their evidence unreliable without making the tampering obvious. Whoever did this grabbed active user tokens from system memory, Leo said. That's not script kiddie stuff. That's someone who knows we're not a Fortune 500 operation with enterprise security. I thanked Leo and made my way through the office, conducting what Wolfe would call field interviews and what I called trying to figure out who was lying. The human element. Vera Conte received me in her corner office with the composed professionalism of someone accustomed to managing crises before they became disasters. Her desk was immaculate, her responses measured, and her concern appeared genuine. "These attacks are sophisticated," she said, reviewing the technical summary Leo had provided. "Too sophisticated for simple office politics. We've investigated powerful interests over the years: real estate developers, municipal contractors, charity administrators. Any of them could have hired professionals to undermine our credibility. But they'd need inside information to know which stories to target. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable possibility that someone here is feeding information to our enemies." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been with Plainsight since its inception. Mr. Goodwin, this magazine is my life's work. If I thought someone on my staff was sabotaging it, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I'd be doing something about it." Miriam Lyle was pacing her cluttered office like a caged predator when I arrived. Her workspace was controlled chaos. Stacks of documents, overflowing bookshelves, and a coffee pot that looked like it had been brewing the same batch since the Clinton administration. "It's the trust," she said without preamble. "Delia Ziegler wants to gut us and turn us into a public relations firm. These attacks aren't random. They're surgical strikes designed to justify taking over editorial control." She pulled a file from one of her stacks and slid it across her desk. "I've been researching the Amaranth Trust's other investments. They have financial interests in several companies we've investigated. Nothing direct, but enough to create conflicts of interest." "You think they're silencing you to protect their investments?" "I think they're using these attacks to justify restructuring us out of existence." Her eyes had the predatory gleam of a reporter who'd scented a story. "The corruption isn't just undermining our credibility. It's creating a paper trail of editorial failures that could justify eliminating our independence entirely." Nina Pape looked up from her design workstation with the expression of someone whose artistic vision was being systematically destroyed. Her office was a riot of color and creativity, with mood boards covering the walls and multiple monitors displaying layout software. "It's personal," she said, adjusting a stylus between her fingers. "Whoever did this knows exactly how we work, what we care about, and how to hurt us most effectively. The corruption wasn't random. It was designed to make us look incompetent." She showed me examples of the altered files, demonstrating how the changes were almost invisible to casual inspection, but devastating under scrutiny. "It's like they wanted to destroy our reputation slowly, making us doubt ourselves and our processes." Carlton Baird received me in his sterile office with the careful precision of someone who billed by the hour and documented every minute. His responses were measured, his concerns focused on legal liability rather than personal betrayal. "The attacks present significant legal exposure," he said, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. "If we publish corrupted information, we face potential libel suits. If we delay publication while verifying everything, we lose relevance and credibility." He walked me through the legal review process, explaining how his annotations had been used to reconstruct their charity investigation. The leak came from my external counsel communications, but those files were properly secured. Someone either intercepted them or had access to systems I believed were secure. Franklin Wheat was visibly shaken when I found him in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of grant applications and financial records. He looked like a man who discovered that his careful documentation had been turned into a weapon against him. "The missing drive contained 2 years of financial records," he said, wringing his hands. "Grant compliance documentation, audit reports, correspondence with the trust, everything they need to evaluate our funding." "Who else knew you carried backup drives?" "Everyone, I suppose. Trust policy requires duplicate records for all grant activities." He gestured toward filing cabinets that looked like they'd survived several natural disasters. "Delia Ziegler has been pushing for real-time access to our financial systems. She says it would streamline oversight, but it would also give them unprecedented control over our operations. The photography connection, Harvey Stoltz, operated out of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, the kind of space that whispered serious artist while maintaining enough commercial polish to attract corporate clients. He was adjusting lighting equipment when I arrived, moving with the fluid precision of someone who understood the relationship between shadow and truth. "You're here about the plain sight photograph," he said without looking up. I figured someone would come asking eventually. "Who commissioned the crop?" A courier service brought a request with cash payment. The note asked for a tight crop on the subjects, removing extraneous environment. I assumed it was for donor materials. He paused in his adjustments. The cash was wrapped in a blue index card with typed instructions. "Did you deliver it?" I gave it back to the courier. I don't make anonymous deliveries. The note specified an address, but I don't work without names and signatures. "What address?" 200 Park Avenue, Amaranth Trust Offices. Attention R. Troy. I made a note. Renata Troy, Delia Ziegler's assistant. The web was getting more tangled by the hour. Domestic intrusion. Back at the Brownstone, I found Fritz in his kitchen with the expression of a man who discovered vandals in his cathedral. He was glowering at his spice rack with the intensity of someone conducting a criminal investigation. "Someone moved my saffron," he announced without preamble. "It belongs to the right of the cumin, never above the oven vent. This morning it was 2 spaces over." I examined the shelf carefully. There was a lip that would prevent jars from sliding, and I found traces of golden saffron dust on the counter where it had been carelessly handled. "Who was in here this morning?" "Everyone," Fritz said darkly. "Your guests came through for coffee. Perhaps they think coffee service does not require respect for the sacred order of spices." I called Wolfe from the hallway phone. "Your kitchen has been violated. Someone with no respect for saffron moved Fritz's jar." "Trespass," Wolfe said simply. "Someone wished to test our attention to domestic order. They wanted to know if we would notice and how we would respond." Analysis and synthesis. Back in the office, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, except for the addition of a botanical journal open on his desk. He listened to my report with the attention of a man cataloging evidence for future use. The technical evidence points to someone with administrative access and intimate knowledge of their systems, I concluded. The photography connection leads directly to the trust's assistant. The domestic intrusion suggests someone testing our awareness and responses. And your assessment of the individuals. Everyone has motive, means, and opportunity. Vera Conte is fighting to preserve her life's work. Miriam Lyle is convinced the trust is orchestrating a takeover. Nina Pape is frustrated by the systematic destruction of editorial integrity. Carlton Baird is focused on legal liability. Franklin Wheat is terrified of losing funding and reputation. Wolfe closed his journal and fixed me with the look of a man who'd reached an uncomfortable conclusion. "We are not merely investigating sabotage, Archie. We are being manipulated by someone who wishes us to discover specific information while remaining blind to other facts." The puppet master theory. The puppet master reality. The question is whether we are being used to expose the saboteur or to provide cover for them. The phone rang with the timing of fate keeping an appointment. I answered to find Owen Vance's voice, tight with panic. "Mr. Goodwin. We need Mr. Wolfe immediately. Something's happened that could shut us down permanently." "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes everything we've discovered look like a warm-up act." I looked at Wolfe, who was already reaching for his jacket. The game, as they say, was afoot, and from the sound of Vance's voice, we were about to discover just how high the stakes really were. The phone call from Owen Vance came at 9:30 Wednesday morning, just as Wolfe was settling into his chair with the morning paper and the satisfied expression of a man whose world was operating according to proper principles. The urgency in Vance's voice cut through the brownstone's carefully maintained tranquility like a fire alarm in a library. "Mr. Wolfe, we need you here immediately. Someone has sent a confession to the Daily Standard under my name, admitting that our Parks Department investigation was fabricated. It's already online and it's destroying us." Wolfe's grunt suggested he found this development both predictable and irritating. "A confession, you say, written in your voice, published without your consent, and timed to maximum damage. How thoroughly professional." "It gets worse," Vance continued, his voice tight with panic. "The confession includes details that only someone with access to our internal editorial process could know. Specific phrases from our legal review, references to sources we've never publicly identified, even our internal style guidelines. Whoever wrote this knows us better than we know ourselves." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured, rising from his chair with the deliberate precision of a man who'd been expecting exactly this kind of escalation. "Archie, retrieve your jacket. We are about to witness the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign. The fabricated confession." The plain sight offices had acquired the atmosphere of a newsroom under siege. Phones rang incessantly with calls from angry readers, concerned advertisers, and reporters seeking comment on what the Daily Standard was calling the biggest journalism scandal of the year. The staff moved with the shell-shocked efficiency of people trying to function while their professional world collapsed around them. Vance led us to his office, where his computer screen displayed the offending article. The headline read, "Plain Sight Editor Confesses. We fabricated evidence to destroy innocent officials." Below it was a detailed statement, supposedly written by Vance, that systematically dismantled every aspect of their Parks Department investigation. "The language is perfect," Vance said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "It uses my sentence structure, my punctuation habits, even the way I build arguments. But the content is poison. It admits to fabricating documents, bribing sources, and deliberately misleading readers." Wolfe studied the text with the attention of a botanist examining a particularly toxic specimen. "The fabrication is sophisticated beyond mere mimicry. This represents intimate knowledge of your editorial voice, your investigative methods, and your legal vulnerabilities." Leo Kim had been hunched over his workstation since dawn, analyzing server logs with the intensity of someone trying to solve a crime against the natural order of information systems. He looked up as we approached, his face carrying the particular strain that comes from discovering that your security measures are about as effective as tissue paper in a thunderstorm. "It didn't come from our systems," he said without preamble, "but it was crafted using information that could only have been obtained from our systems." The confession referenced specific phrases from Carlton's legal review notes, quotes from source interviews that were never transcribed, and internal terminology we've never used publicly. "Someone harvested your intellectual property and weaponized it," I observed. "Exactly. But here's the really disturbing part. The email that delivered the confession to the Daily Standard was sent from a spoofed address that perfectly mimicked our domain authentication. SPF records, DKIM signatures, everything checked out. To their email servers, it looked like it came directly from Owen's official account. Wolfe made a sound that might have been approval or indigestion. Professional work. Someone with both technical sophistication and intimate knowledge of your editorial processes. The institutional response. As if summoned by the chaos, Delia Ziegler arrived with an entourage that included her assistant, Renata Troy, and two men who looked like they audited corporations for sport. They moved through the newsroom with the controlled efficiency of an occupying force, their expressions suggesting they were here to restore order to a situation that had gotten completely out of hand. "Mr. Wolfe," Ziegler said, her voice carrying the controlled authority of someone accustomed to managing crises before they became disasters. "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation. The Amaranth Trust cannot continue funding an organization that has become a liability to our other grantees. Indeed, Wolfe replied. The question is whether Plain Sight has become a liability through its own actions or through the actions of others. Renata Troy stepped forward with a tablet and the kind of professional competence that comes from working for people who don't tolerate mistakes. The Trust is implementing emergency oversight protocols. We need immediate access to all editorial files, financial records, and correspondence to assess the extent of potential legal exposure. An audit, Vance said, the word carrying the weight of a death sentence. A necessity, Ziegler corrected. If these allegations are true, the Trust faces potential liability for funding fraudulent journalism. If they're false, we need documentation to support Plain Sight's defense. And if the audit reveals information that could be used to justify shutting down the magazine, I asked. Troy's smile was professionally neutral and completely empty. The Trust's primary obligation is to our fiduciary responsibilities. Mr. Goodwin, editorial independence is a luxury we can only afford when it doesn't compromise our legal standing. The surveillance network. While the institutional drama played out in the conference room, I took the opportunity to examine the building's security arrangements. The back stairwell that opened onto the alley had been propped open with a small wedge. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to provide access to someone who knew the building's security protocols. In the alley, I found evidence of recent surveillance. Cigarette butts from a brand that suggested professional patience, tire marks from a vehicle that had been parked for extended periods, and scuff marks on the fire escape that indicated someone had been using it to observe the upper floors. I called Saul Panzer from the alley. "We've got watchers," I told him. "Professional ones with the patience to maintain long-term observation." "Brentfield Protective Services," Saul replied without hesitation. "I've been tracking their movements since yesterday. They're running a comprehensive surveillance operation, building observation, electronic monitoring, and what looks like information gathering on all the magazine staff." "Working for whom?" "Officially, they're contracted to Langford Himes Development for security consulting. Unofficially, they're conducting industrial espionage against anyone who might interfere with Himes's real estate projects, including journalists who investigate fraudulent eviction schemes. Especially journalists who investigate fraudulent eviction schemes," Saul confirmed. "I've documented at least 3 occasions when Brentfield operatives accessed the building after hours. They have someone on the inside." The domestic violation, back at the Brown Stone, Fritz met me at the door with the expression of a man who'd discovered vandals in his cathedral. He was holding a small glass jar with the careful precision of someone handling evidence in a criminal trial. "Someone moved my saffron," he announced with the gravity of a man reporting a violation of the natural order. "It belongs on the 3rd shelf, between the cumin and the cardamom. This morning I found it on the counter, and the jar had been opened." I examined the spice rack carefully. The arrangement was Fritz's masterpiece, alphabetical within categories with heights adjusted for both accessibility and aesthetic harmony. The saffron jar showed traces of golden powder around the rim, suggesting it had been handled by someone unfamiliar with its proper care. "When did you last use it?" "Monday, for the bouillabaisse. It was properly placed and sealed. Someone with no respect for the sacred order of spices has been in my kitchen." I called Wolfe from the hallway phone. "Your kitchen has been violated. Someone moved Fritz's saffron and left fingerprints on the jar." "Trespass," Wolfe said simply. "Someone wished to demonstrate their ability to enter our sanctuary and disturb our domestic order. They wanted us to know they had been here." The behavioral test. That afternoon, Wolfe summoned the entire editorial board to the Brownstone for what he called a consultation on crisis management. They arrived in various states of professional anxiety, each carrying the weight of a magazine that seemed to be dissolving around them. Before their arrival, Wolfe had instructed me to make subtle adjustments to the office environment. The Persian rug was pulled slightly askew, the photograph on its stand was tilted at a barely perceptible angle, and the blue index card from the original envelope was positioned diagonally on his desk blotter. Observe their reactions to minor disorder, Wolfe instructed. Someone among them cannot resist correcting imperfections before addressing larger issues. Vera Conte arrived first, surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to managing details, and took her seat without touching anything. Miriam Lyle noticed the tilted photograph but left it alone, respecting what she assumed was Wolfe's intentional arrangement. Nina Pape and Franklin Wheat entered together, both too distracted by the crisis to notice environmental details. But Carlton Baird, arriving precisely on time, immediately moved to straighten the photograph, adjust the rug with the toe of his shoe, and, after a moment's hesitation, square the index card with the corner of the blotter. "Thank you for coming," Wolfe said, his eyes fixed on Carlton with the intensity of a predator who'd finally identified his prey. "We have much to discuss about the systematic destruction of your magazine's credibility." Carlton's hand froze halfway to his briefcase. For just a moment, his professional composure cracked, revealing something that looked very much like fear. "The confession published today was not written by Mr. Vance," Wolfe continued. "It was crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of his writing style, access to internal editorial documents, and the technical sophistication to forge authentication protocols. Someone who has been systematically undermining plain sight from within while providing information to external interests." The silence in the room was thick enough to require a building permit. Carlton's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Wolfe." "It is a serious situation, Mr. Baird. Someone has been playing a very dangerous game, using their position of trust to facilitate the destruction of the institution they were hired to protect." Carlton straightened in his chair, his legal training asserting itself even as his world began to collapse. "I assume you have evidence to support these allegations?" Wolfe smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this question. "Indeed I do. Archie, please show Mr. Baird the photographs, Mr. Pans are obtained from the building's security cameras." I handed Carlton a manila envelope containing images that Saul had captured of him entering the building at unusual hours, accessing workstations that weren't his, and meeting with individuals who had no legitimate business in a magazine office. "The evidence is quite comprehensive," Wolfe observed, as Carlton studied the photographs with the expression of a man watching his career evaporate. "Your meetings with Brentfield operatives, your after-hours access to editorial systems, your systematic collection of information that was later used to craft attacks against your own magazine." "This is circumstantial," Carlton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps. But combined with your compulsive need to correct minor disorders, a behavioral pattern that led you to straighten our deliberately arranged evidence, it forms a compelling picture of someone who cannot resist imposing order on chaos, even when that chaos serves their purposes." The room erupted in questions and accusations, but Wolfe's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mr. Baird has been systematically betraying plain sight to serve the interests of Langford Himes Development, providing them with advance warning of investigations, access to editorial content, and the technical expertise necessary to corrupt your systems from within." Carlton's shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure settled upon him. "You don't understand the pressure," he said quietly. "The threats, the financial leverage, the promises of partnership if I cooperated. They made it clear that plain sight was going to be destroyed one way or another. I thought if I helped them control the process, I could minimize the damage. Instead," Wolfe observed, "you maximized it. Your betrayal has not only destroyed the magazine you are hired to protect, but it has corrupted the very concept of truth that journalism is meant to serve." The trespass had been subtle, but its consequences were absolute. The sanctuary of the brownstone had been violated, the integrity of plain sight had been corrupted, and the trust that binds professional relationships had been shattered. But truth, as Wolfe often observed, has a way of asserting itself even in the most carefully constructed deceptions. The game was far from over, but the pieces were finally visible on the board. And Nero Wolfe, master of intellectual combat, was preparing for the final confrontation. The morning after Carlton Baird's exposure brought the kind of escalation that transforms intellectual chess matches into institutional warfare. I was reviewing Saul Panzer's overnight surveillance reports when the phone rang with the particular urgency that suggests someone's carefully constructed world is collapsing in real time. The legal offensive. By 9 o'clock, our front steps had acquired a thick envelope from Avery and Marks, the kind of white shoe legal firm that doesn't scuff easily and charges accordingly. Inside was a subpoena duces tecum addressed to Nero Wolfe, commanding production of all communications, memoranda, recordings, notes, and materials relating to Plain Sight magazine, its staff, and the Amaranth Trust. It came bundled with an emergency petition highlighting what they called apparent financial irregularities in the magazine's grant reporting. Professional work, Wolfe observed, studying the documents with the attention of a botanist examining a particularly toxic specimen. Someone has been preparing this offensive for some time. The petition included 2 spreadsheets that purported to show duplicate invoices, misallocated travel expenses, and something called a restricted funds leak in Franklin Wheat's financial management. But Wolfe's trained eye caught what the lawyers had missed. "Observe the formatting, Archie," he said, tapping specific cells with his fingernail. Column D shows currencies formatted with a narrow, non-breaking space after the dollar sign. Column G uses a standard thin space, 2 different templates, different editors, and here, this date uses an N dash in a cell where the balance is negative. Mr. Wheat may have made errors, but these documents were harmonized by a committee. Committee name: Rosamond Tierney. Perhaps. But the mind that shows these elements understands auditors' appetites intimately. The connected web Leo Kim called from Plain Sight with news that transformed our understanding of the entire conspiracy. "They were here last night," he said, his voice tight with professional outrage. 3 people in business attire, working for hours with the methodical precision of accountants. But they didn't steal anything. They organized everything. When we arrived at the magazine offices, we found the conference room transformed into a comprehensive display of Plain Sight's investigative work over the past 2 years. Every story, every source, every piece of evidence had been laid out with prosecutorial precision. But this wasn't random documentation. It was a carefully curated exhibition designed to reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. "They've connected everything," Owen Vance explained, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and professional admiration. "The Parks Department, corruption, the charity embezzlement, the real estate fraud. They're all linked. Not just thematically, but operationally." Red lines drawn across the documents showed the relationships between seemingly unrelated cases. The Parks Department contracts were awarded to companies owned by the same shell corporation that was embezzling from children's charities. The charity money was being used to finance fraudulent eviction schemes in buildings that the Parks Department was supposed to be renovating. "A closed loop," Wolfe murmured, studying the display. "Public money stolen through municipal corruption, laundered through charitable organizations, and reinvested in real estate schemes that generate more opportunities for public corruption. Elegant in its criminal simplicity." The human cost Nina Pape pulled me aside with information that elevated the stakes beyond institutional politics. "They accessed our source protection database," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Names, addresses, contact information for 47 people who trusted us to protect their identities while they exposed corruption. The implications were immediate and devastating. 3 sources had already received anonymous phone calls warning them to reconsider their recent decisions. 2 more had been fired for unspecified policy violations. Most ominously, the Parks Department bookkeeper who'd provided the original documents hadn't been seen since the previous day. I called Saul immediately. "We need protective surveillance on 47 people." "Already in progress," he replied with the efficiency that made him invaluable. Professional intimidation teams are conducting systematic campaigns to neutralize anyone who might testify about municipal corruption. This isn't just about stopping a story, it's about eliminating witnesses. The institutional response. As if summoned by the chaos, Delia Ziegler arrived with her assistant Renata Troy and Marcus Webb, General Counsel for the Amaranth Trust. They surveyed the violated newsroom with a professional detachment of people accustomed to managing disasters before they became catastrophes. "This changes everything," Ziegler announced with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The trust cannot continue funding an organization that has become a target for criminal enterprises. The liability exposure is simply too great." "The liability appears to be mutual," Wolfe observed. "If Plain Sight's investigations have accurately documented a comprehensive criminal conspiracy, the Trust's decision to withdraw funding at this particular moment could be construed as obstruction of justice." Webb stepped forward with the careful precision of a lawyer who'd been anticipating this conversation. "Mr. Wolfe, the Trust's fiduciary obligations require us to protect our other grantees and our institutional reputation. We cannot allow one organization's investigative activities to jeopardize our entire mission, even if those activities are exposing crimes that directly impact the Trust's other charitable investments." "Especially then," Webb replied. "Any suggestion that we're involved in criminal investigations could trigger regulatory audits that would paralyze our operations for years." The technical escalation. While the institutional drama played out, Leo provided disturbing technical intelligence. Whoever broke in didn't just organize our files. They installed monitoring equipment, bridge boxes on our network switches, keystroke loggers on workstations, even audio surveillance in the conference room. They're not just watching us now, they're listening to everything. "Professional surveillance," I observed. "Corporate warfare," Wolfe corrected. "Someone is building a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to anticipate and counter every move you might make." The sophistication extended beyond simple espionage. Analysis of the forged confession published under Vance's name revealed technical details that only someone with intimate knowledge of their editorial systems could have known. The document used Vance's sentence structure, his punctuation habits, even his preferred terminology, but the content was designed to systematically destroy every aspect of their Parks Department investigation. The domestic violation. Back at the brownstone, Fritz met me with the expression of a man whose cathedral had been desecrated. "They have been here again," he announced, examining his spice rack with forensic intensity. "The paprika was moved, the oregano was opened, and someone used my best olive oil without permission." The violations were subtle but deliberate. Someone had prepared a meal in Fritz's kitchen, eggs Benedict, judging by the residual hollandaise traces, using his ingredients and equipment, then cleaned up just enough to make the intrusion obvious without causing serious damage. "They are demonstrating their ability to reach what we value," Wolfe observed when I reported the incident. "Not merely our professional work, but our domestic sanctuary." The final positioning. By evening, the pressure had transformed from subtle manipulation to open warfare. Saul reported that Brentfield Protective Services had assembled a group of concerned citizens outside the Plain Sight offices, holding signs accusing the magazine of slander and demanding its immediate closure. More ominously, intelligence suggested a planned retrieval operation targeting the magazine's server room. "The net has tightened," Wolfe announced, his eyes carrying the particular gleam that appeared when intellectual challenges became personal affronts. They have moved from covert sabotage to overt intimidation. It is time to respond in kind. I picked up the phone and began making calls with the methodical precision of a general deploying troops. Nathaniel Parker would handle the legal offensive, filing motions to quash the subpoenas and expose the forged financial documents. Saul would coordinate protective surveillance for the endangered sources while securing the magazine's remaining evidence. Fred Durkin would handle the more direct aspects of counter-surveillance. And tomorrow evening, Wolfe concluded, settling back in his chair with satisfaction, we will hold our gathering. All of them, Ziegler, Troy, Webb, the entire editorial board, and our newly cooperative Mr. Baird. It is time to demonstrate that pressure, properly applied, reveals the true nature of whatever it touches. The brownstone had been transformed from a sanctuary of intellectual contemplation into a command center for institutional warfare. The pressure had indeed increased, but pressure, as any good detective knows, has a way of exposing the fractures in even the most carefully constructed facades. And Nero Wolfe, master of intellectual combat, was preparing to apply enough pressure to shatter the entire conspiracy. If you've never watched a man conduct a symphony of human behavior without lifting so much as a finger from his desk blotter, you've missed seeing Nero Wolfe transform from passive observer to active orchestrator. Thursday morning brought the kind of calculated precision that turns defensive investigations into offensive warfare, and Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 11 o'clock with the expression of a general whose battle plans had reached their crucial phase. Today, Archie, we cease being reactive and become proactive, he announced, settling into his chair with the deliberate satisfaction of a man whose intellectual trap was ready to be sprung. Our adversaries have revealed their methods, their motivations, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. It is time to exploit all three. The Master Ledger Gambit, Wolfe's first strategic move, was what he called informational warfare, a sophisticated bait operation designed to trace the paths of betrayal through the Plainsight organization. He instructed me to contact each principal player with news of a master ledger that had supposedly been recovered from the corrupted files, but each person would receive a different crucial detail. Miss Ziegler is to be told the ledger documents improper pre-clearance communications between the trust and municipal procurement officials. Wolfe dictated with the precision of a man placing chess pieces. Mr. Webb will hear that it contains evidence of restricted donor funds being channeled through shell corporations. Miss Troy will learn that it includes photographers' notes identifying her by initials as the courier contact. The beauty of the operation lay in its psychological precision. Each piece of bait was designed to trigger the specific anxieties and compulsions of its target. Vera. Conte would hear that the ledger vindicated the magazine's financial management. Miriam Lyle would learn it contained corroborating evidence for her real estate investigation. Nina Pape would be told it proved systematic tampering with publication metadata. And Franklin Wheat, I asked, preparing my notepad. That it reconciles every grant expenditure down to the penny, Wolfe replied with the slight smile of a man who understood the psychology of desperate accountants. The technical trap. While I made the calls, Leo Kim was implementing what he termed digital archaeology, creating a carefully crafted decoy file labeled masterledger_final_restricted.docx. and placing it where curious parties might attempt to access it. Each version contained a unique embedded phrase corresponding to the information I'd fed to each suspect. The file will be irresistible to anyone who believes they need to verify or suppress its contents, Wolfe explained, and Mr. Panzer will monitor which phrases appear in subsequent communications. The psychological pressure was immediate and revealing. Within 2 hours, Delia Ziegler had called an emergency meeting with Marcus Webb. Renata Troy had contacted the mysterious courier service that had been facilitating anonymous communications. Most tellingly, someone with administrative access to the Trust's systems had attempted to access the decoy file using search terms that corresponded exactly to the information I'd provided to Webb. The legal counteroffensive Nathaniel Parker's report came at precisely 2 o'clock, delivered with the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd found the perfect statute to demolish his opponent's case. The motion to quash has been filed, Mr. Wolfe, and it's devastating. We've included technical analysis proving the financial documents were fabricated, along with metadata showing they were created on systems registered to Langford Himes Development. Excellent, Wolfe murmured. And the institutional response? Panic, essentially. Avery and Marks are scrambling to distance themselves from what they're beginning to realize is a criminal conspiracy. I've also arranged for certain financial journalists to begin asking uncomfortable questions about the Amaranth Trust's relationship with real estate development interests. The domestic revelation that afternoon brought an unexpected breakthrough in our investigation of the kitchen violations. Fritz, still indignant about the saffron trespass, provided details that transformed our understanding of the domestic intrusions. The olive oil used was my finest Tuscan variety, Fritz reported with the precision of a forensic analyst, reserved for special occasions and used, I believe, to prepare eggs Benedict. The technique was professional, but the choice of ingredients was personal. Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. Personal in what way? The saffron was handled carelessly, as if by someone unfamiliar with its proper storage. But the olive oil selection showed intimate knowledge of my kitchen inventory. Someone who had observed my cooking, perhaps even complimented my hollandaise preparation. The implication was clear and disturbing. Owen Vance, who had indeed praised Fritz's hollandaise on several occasions, had been the domestic intruder. The revelation cast his role in an entirely new light, not merely a desperate editor seeking help, but a man playing his own complex game within the larger conspiracy. Mr. Vance sent the original envelope, I said, working through the implications, but he also wanted to demonstrate his ability to penetrate our sanctuary, a test of our awareness and his own capabilities. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Desperation and manipulation are not mutually exclusive. Mr. Vance wishes to be seen as victim while retaining the prerogatives of a player. The systematic pressure campaign. Throughout the afternoon, Wolfe orchestrated what he called multi-vector pressure application, simultaneous attacks on the conspiracy from legal, financial, and reputational directions. Saul Panzer coordinated protective surveillance for the endangered sources while documenting the connections between Brentfield Protective Services and Langford Himes Development. Fred Durkin handled the more direct aspects of counter-surveillance, ensuring that our own operations remained secure. The pressure produced immediate results. Carlton Baird, abandoned by his criminal confederates and facing federal prosecution, arrived at the brownstone that evening in a state of complete professional collapse. "They're throwing me to the wolves," he said, slumping into the red leather chair with the posture of a man whose carefully constructed world had disintegrated. Avery and Marks withdrew their representation. The Trust's counsel won't return my calls. Himes's people act like they've never heard my name. Betrayal, Mr. Baird is indeed a two-edged sword, Wolfe observed without sympathy. However, you possess information that could significantly alter your legal prospects. What followed was a 2-hour confession that revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Baird detailed the systematic corruption of municipal contracts, the laundering of public funds through charitable organizations, and the coordinated campaign to eliminate investigative journalism that threatened their operations. Most importantly, he provided documentary evidence of direct communications with Delia Ziegler and Marcus Webb regarding the specific sabotage of Plain Sight. The institutional crackdown. By evening, the coordinated pressure campaign had achieved its intended effect. The New York Times was preparing a front-page exposé of the Amaranth Trust's questionable oversight practices. A prominent ethics watchdog organization had demanded an independent investigation into the Trust's financial dealings. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office had announced a grand jury investigation into Langford Himes' development's real estate activities. "The net has tightened considerably," Wolfe observed with satisfaction as the reports filtered in. "Our adversaries are being forced to react rather than act, revealing their true priorities and vulnerabilities in the process." The final positioning, as we prepared for Friday evening's gathering, the culmination of Wolfe's strategic manipulation, he reviewed our intelligence with the satisfaction of a chess master whose opponent had finally been maneuvered into an inescapable position. "Tomorrow evening, Archie, we will demonstrate that institutional integrity, once compromised, can be restored through the proper application of intellectual force. We will expose not merely individual crimes, but the systematic corruption that made those crimes possible." The positioning was complete. Wolfe had transformed a defensive investigation into an offensive campaign that had exposed a comprehensive criminal conspiracy, identified its key players, and gathered the evidence necessary to ensure their prosecution. The brownstone, having weathered subtle trespasses and overt intimidation, was ready for its final act. "The truth, Archie, has been hiding in plain sight all along," Wolfe said as he closed his evening paper. "Tomorrow, we will ensure that everyone present has the opportunity to see it clearly." The game was no longer about protecting Plain Sight magazine or exposing individual saboteurs. It had become a demonstration that even the most sophisticated institutional corruption could not withstand the focused application of logic, evidence, and moral authority properly directed. The stage was set for the reckoning. By 7 o'clock Friday evening, the office was dressed for an execution, not with black bunting, but with the precise geometry that announces a superior mind has arranged space to compel inferior ones to reveal themselves. I'd positioned the red leather chairs in a careful semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, close enough for intimidation, but far enough apart to prevent whispered conspiracies. The black wooden easel stood at the proper angle with our cropped photograph mounted like evidence in a capital case. And the blue index card rested on Wolfe's blotter under a paperweight, its 7 names facing the assembled like an indictment waiting to be read. Fritz had delivered the coffee service and withdrawn with the expression of a man whose cathedral was about to be invaded by Philistines. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 7 o'clock, moving with the deliberate precision of a judge preparing to deliver verdicts that would end several careers. He settled into his chair, arranged his 1/7 of a ton with ceremonial care, and surveyed the empty seats with the satisfaction of a chess master whose trap was finally ready to be sprung. The assembly of the guilty. They arrived with the punctuality of people who understood that tardiness would be interpreted as admission of guilt. Owen Vance led the procession, clutching his leather portfolio like a life preserver in a storm that was about to get considerably worse. His face had acquired new lines since Tuesday, and his tie looked like it had been knotted by a man whose hands weren't entirely steady. The Amaranth Trust delegation entered with institutional authority, wrapped around them like armor that was about to prove inadequate. Delia Ziegler moved with controlled efficiency, her dark suit and sensible shoes suggesting she was prepared for either a board meeting or a funeral, though she probably hadn't expected to be planning her own. Marcus Webb followed with the careful precision of a lawyer who'd spent the day discovering that his clients had been considerably less than forthcoming about their activities. Renata Troy brought up the rear, her tablet loaded with what looked like damage control strategies, and her expression suggesting she was calculating the odds of professional survival. The Plain Sight editorial board filed in with the shell-shocked efficiency of people trying to function while their professional world collapsed around them. Vera Conte maintained her silver-haired composure, but her eyes carried the particular strain that comes from discovering that institutional loyalty might be a luxury she could no longer afford. Miriam Lyle entered with the restless energy of a reporter who'd finally gotten access to the biggest story of her career, only to discover she was one of its central characters. Nina Paper moved with her usual artistic grace, but her tablet was loaded with emergency publication schedules that suggested she was redesigning layouts for headlines she'd never expected to write. Franklin Wheat arrived with the apologetic precision of an accountant whose carefully maintained records had been turned into weapons against the institution he'd served faithfully. Carlton Baird was the last to arrive, and if the others were various species of institutional predator, he was definitely the wounded animal trying to avoid being devoured by the pack. His charcoal suit was wrinkled, his perfectly knotted tie had been loosened in defeat, and he moved with the posture of a man who'd already accepted that his career was over and was hoping to minimize the criminal charges. The master ledger Gambit Wolfe surveyed his assembled guests with the expression of a botanist examining specimens that had proven more toxic than originally suspected. He allowed the silence to build until it became oppressive, then spoke with the deliberate precision of a prosecutor outlining charges. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday I informed each of you that we had recovered a master ledger documenting various irregularities in the Plainsight matter. That ledger does not exist. It was a fabrication designed to observe which of you would attempt to access it, and with what degree of anxiety. The results have been most illuminating. The silence that followed was thick enough to require architectural support. I distributed copies of Leo's technical analysis, server access logs, search queries, and metadata that painted a comprehensive picture of who had been looking for what and when. Miss Ziegler, Wolfe continued, his eyes settling on her with the weight of accumulated evidence, you were told the ledger documented improper communications between the trust and municipal procurement officials. Within 2 hours, there were searches from trust systems for pre-clearance protocols and municipal interface documentation. Ziegler's composure remained intact, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Standard due diligence, Mr. Wolfe. When allegations are made, we investigate. Indeed. Mr. Webb, you were informed the ledger contained evidence of restricted donor funds being channeled through shell corporations. Your department's systems subsequently searched for restricted flow-through documentation and Greybird Subsidiaries LLC, a company name that appears nowhere in Plainsight's actual records. Webb shifted in his chair with the careful precision of a lawyer calculating liability exposure. Defensive research, Mr. Wolfe. We needed to understand potential allegations. And Miss Troy. Wolfe's gaze moved to the assistant, whose tablet had become a shield she held with white knuckles. You were told the ledger included photographer's notes, identifying you by initials as a courier contact. There was an immediate image search for Stoltz Documentation RT from your workstation. The technical web, Leo Kim stepped forward from his position by the bookcase, carrying printouts that looked like technical evidence in a federal case. The surveillance equipment installed in the Plainsight offices was professional grade, he reported with the dry precision of a man who preferred machines to meetings. Bridge boxes on network switches, keystroke loggers on workstations, audio surveillance in the conference room. Someone with substantial resources wanted comprehensive intelligence on the magazine's operations. Brentfield Protective Services, I added, consulting my notes. Contracted by Langford Himes Development for what they called security consulting. In reality, they were conducting industrial espionage against anyone who might interfere with Himes's real estate projects. Wolfe nodded approvingly. The technical sophistication extended beyond simple surveillance. The forged confession published under Mr. Vance's name required intimate knowledge of his writing style, access to internal editorial documents, and the ability to spoof authentication protocols. Professional work executed by people with both technical expertise and insider information. Carlton's confession. Carlton Baird had been growing increasingly agitated during Wolfe's exposition, and now he stood with the desperate energy of someone whose last hope had been extinguished. "I provided the access," he said, his voice carrying the weight of complete professional collapse. "Hymes's people approached me 6 months ago. They knew about my gambling debts, my divorce settlement, the second mortgage I couldn't afford. They offered to solve my financial problems in exchange for information about Plainsight's investigations." His confession tumbled out with the desperate precision of a man who'd been rehearsing it in his mind for weeks. He detailed the systematic corruption, how he'd provided system access codes, editorial schedules, and advance warning of which stories posed the greatest threat to Hymes's operations. How he'd facilitated the installation of surveillance equipment during after-hours visits. How he'd exported legal review notes that were later used to reverse engineer the magazine's investigations. "They said it would be controlled," Carlton continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. "They said the magazine would be restructured, not destroyed. I thought if I helped manage the process, I could minimize the damage to people I'd worked with for 3 years. Instead," Wolfe observed, "you maximized it. Your betrayal provided the technical means for systematic sabotage, the legal justification for institutional intervention, and the moral cover for criminal conspiracy." The institutional conspiracy. Wolfe's attention turned to the trust delegation, his expression suggesting he was about to dissect their carefully constructed facade with surgical precision. "The Amaranth Trust's role in this conspiracy extends far beyond simple oversight," he announced. "Miss Ziegler, your organization has significant financial interests in entities that stood to lose millions from Plainsight's investigations. Board members who sit on the boards of companies benefiting from the municipal contracts the magazine was exposing. Investment portfolios that included Langford Hymes Development and the shell corporations used to launder public funds." He gestured toward the documents I'd prepared. "The evidence includes financial records showing direct coordination between trust accounts and Hymes development projects. Legal memoranda outlining strategies for eliminating investigative journalism without triggering First Amendment challenges. Communications proving that the Trust's board was fully aware that their oversight activities were designed to facilitate criminal enterprises." Delia Ziegler's composure finally cracked. "The Trust has fiduciary obligations to protect our other grantees and our institutional reputation. We cannot allow one organization's activities to jeopardize our entire mission. Even when those activities involve exposing crimes that directly benefit your board members," Wolfe asked. "Even when your fiduciary obligations require you to participate in obstruction of justice. The domestic violation. There is also the matter of domestic trespass," Wolfe continued, his tone suggesting that violations of the brownstone sanctuary carried particular weight. "Someone entered my kitchen and disturbed Fritz's carefully maintained spice arrangement. The saffron was moved, the olive oil was used to prepare eggs Benedict, and the cleanup was deliberately incomplete, designed to announce the intrusion rather than conceal it." Owen Vance's face went pale. "Mr. Wolfe, You wish to demonstrate your ability to penetrate our sanctuary," Wolfe said. "You wanted to test whether we would notice and how we would respond. It was a psychological probe designed to measure our awareness and establish your own capabilities as more than merely a desperate editor seeking help." The systematic revelation. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving from face to face with methodical precision. The conspiracy operated on multiple levels, each designed to provide plausible deniability while achieving systematic destruction of editorial integrity. Mr. Baird provided technical access and legal cover. The Trust provided financial pressure and institutional justification. Hymes provided surveillance capability and enforcement. Each participant believed they were managing their own limited involvement while someone else orchestrated the larger campaign. He paused, allowing the weight of accumulated evidence to settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. But the most sophisticated element was the psychological manipulation designed to make each participant believe they were acting from necessity rather than choice. Mr. Baird was convinced he was minimizing damage. Ms. Ziegler was persuaded she was protecting institutional integrity. Mr. Vance was led to believe he was saving his magazine through strategic revelation of his enemy's crimes. The pressure campaign. The attacks on plain sight were not random acts of sabotage, Wolfe continued. They were surgical strikes designed to achieve specific objectives. The Parks Department story rollback demonstrated vulnerability to internal manipulation. The charity investigation leak eliminated key sources while testing the magazine's response to betrayal. The real estate file corruption was designed to make their most dangerous investigation appear unreliable while preserving the appearance of editorial incompetence rather than external interference. Nina Pape looked up from her tablet with the expression of someone who'd finally seen the complete picture. They weren't just trying to stop our stories. They were trying to destroy our credibility so thoroughly that no one would believe anything we published. Precisely, Ms. Papin. The goal was not merely to suppress specific investigations, but to eliminate plain sight as a credible voice in investigative journalism. The systematic corruption was designed to justify institutional intervention that would transform an independent magazine into a controlled public relations operation. The web of complicity. Miriam Lyle had been taking notes throughout Wolfe's exposition, her reporter's instincts engaged, even as she watched her professional world collapse around her. So everyone was being manipulated, she said. Baird thought he was protecting us. The trust thought they were protecting their investments. Vance thought he was exposing the conspiracy, but someone was orchestrating all of it. Indeed, Miss Lyle. Someone with the sophistication to understand institutional psychology, the resources to coordinate technical surveillance, and the patience to execute a campaign that would achieve their objectives while making their opponents destroy each other. Wolfe's eyes moved around the room, settling briefly on each participant before returning to his folded hands. The evidence gathered by my staff, combined with Mr. Baird's confession and the technical documentation provided by Mr. Kim, paints a comprehensive picture of systematic institutional corruption. But it also reveals that this corruption was not merely opportunistic. It was strategically designed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses of each participant. The partial resolution. The silence that followed was the silence of people realizing that their carefully constructed rationalizations had been systematically dismantled. But Wolfe wasn't finished. Tomorrow evening, he announced, I will identify the individual whose mind conceived and orchestrated this entire campaign. Someone who understood that the most effective way to destroy investigative journalism was not through direct censorship, but through systematic corruption that would make the journalists destroy themselves. He stood slowly, his movement carrying the weight of institutional authority and moral certainty. You may go, but you will not escape the consequences of your choices. The evidence has been provided to the appropriate authorities. Justice will follow with the precision of natural law. As they filed out, each carrying the weight of exposure and the certainty of prosecution, I reflected on the elegant precision of Wolfe's intellectual warfare. He had revealed the systematic nature of the conspiracy while maintaining the mystery of its ultimate architect. The office gathering was complete, but the final revelation awaited. Someone in that room was more than a participant. They were the mastermind. And tomorrow evening, Nero Wolfe would demonstrate exactly how truth, properly applied, could restore justice even to the most corrupted institutions. The stage was set for the final act. Saturday evening brought the kind of atmospheric pressure that transforms intellectual combat into moral theater. The office had been arranged with surgical precision, chairs positioned for optimal psychological impact, the Persian rug straightened to geometric perfection, and the cropped photograph mounted on its easel like evidence in a capital case. Fritz had delivered coffee service and withdrawn with the solemnity of a man whose cathedral was about to witness the final judgment of souls who had trespassed against the natural order of truth. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 7:30, moving with the deliberate authority of a judge whose verdict had been reached through irrefutable logic. He settled into his chair, arranged his seventh of a ton with ceremonial precision, and surveyed the assembled company with the expression of a man who was about to demonstrate that even the most sophisticated conspiracies could not withstand the focused application of intellectual force, the assembly of judgment. They returned because they had no choice, not from legal compulsion alone, but from the psychological necessity of learning exactly how much had been discovered and what fragments of their carefully constructed worlds might yet be salvaged. The Amaranth Trust delegation arrived with diminished authority but maintained composure. Delia Ziegler moved with controlled efficiency. Marcus Webb preserved his lawyer's careful precision, and Renata Troy clutched her tablet with the practiced competence of someone accustomed to documenting institutional disasters. The Plain Sight editorial board followed with the determined exhaustion of people who'd spent 48 hours watching their professional world reveal its hidden architecture of deception. Owen Vance looked like a man who'd been performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. The others, Vera Conte, Miriam Lyle, Nina Pape, and Franklin Wheat, carried the particular strain of people discovering that institutions they'd trusted had been systematically corrupted from within. Carlton Baird entered last. His appearance deteriorated beyond professional recovery. His confession had stripped away his lawyer's armor, leaving only a man facing the consequences of choices that had seemed reasonable when made in darkness. The orchestrated approach. Wolfe allowed the silence to build until it became oppressive, then spoke with the measured precision of a professor delivering a lecture that would rewrite the understanding of everyone present. Ladies and gentlemen, this case began with an anonymous envelope containing a cashier's check, a carefully cropped photograph, and a list of 7 names. I stated yesterday that this envelope was not sent by a friend of Plain Sight magazine, but by someone who wanted me to become involved in your affairs. Tonight I will reveal not only who sent that envelope, but why they chose such an elaborate method of engagement. He gestured toward Owen Vance, whose face had gone pale, but whose eyes remained steady. Mr. Vance, you approached me anonymously because you understood that I would not accept a conventional case of journalistic sabotage. You required something that would pique my intellectual curiosity, a puzzle wrapped in mystery and delivered with theatrical precision. Vance's voice was quiet, but firm when he responded. I needed to know if you were truly the man your reputation claimed, Mr. Wolfe. I couldn't afford to bring you into a case that wouldn't be pursued with absolute thoroughness. Indeed, Wolfe acknowledged. The domestic trespasses, Fritz's displaced saffron, the use of his olive oil to prepare eggs Benedict, a dish whose preparation you had previously complimented, were your tests of our household's observational capabilities. You wished to gauge whether we would notice subtle intrusions and how we would respond to violations of our domestic sanctuary. The technical mastermind. Wolfe's attention shifted to Renata Troy, whose professional composure had remained remarkably intact throughout the proceedings. However, Mr. Vance, while you orchestrated the approach and conducted reconnaissance, you did not possess the technical sophistication necessary to execute the systematic sabotage that nearly destroyed Plain Sight magazine. He gestured toward me, and I distributed copies of employment records that Saul had obtained through channels that were probably legal. Miss Troy, your resume with the Amaranth Trust indicates administrative experience with charitable organizations. It does not mention your previous employment with Meridian Information Systems, a contractor specializing in corporate intelligence and digital forensics. Troy's tablet had become a shield, but her voice remained professionally steady. My previous employment is a matter of public record, Mr. Wolfe. Public, perhaps, but deliberately omitted from your trust application, Wolfe replied. Meridian specializes in what they term institutional vulnerability assessment, the systematic identification and exploitation of weaknesses in organizations that threaten their clients' interests. You brought those capabilities to your position with the trust. The systematic evidence. Leo Kim stepped forward with technical documentation that painted a comprehensive picture of sophisticated sabotage. The surveillance equipment installed in the Plainside offices required enterprise-level expertise, he reported. Bridge boxes on network switches, keystroke loggers that could harvest active authentication tokens, audio surveillance that could be remotely activated. This wasn't script kiddie hacking. This was professional intelligence work. The forged confession published under Mr. Vance's name, Wolfe continued, required not only stylometric analysis of his writing patterns, but also the technical capability to spoof domain authentication protocols. Miss Troy, your Meridian training included advanced document forensics and network security penetration. I handed out copies of financial records that showed the complex web connecting all the major players. The Amaranth Trust's investment portfolio includes holdings in Langford Himes Development, but those investments are managed through accounts controlled by Meridian Information Systems. Miss Troy was not merely an administrative assistant. She was a corporate intelligence operative conducting what her former employer would call institutional neutralization. The psychological architecture. Wolfe leaned forward, his attention focused on Troy with the intensity of a predator who'd finally cornered sophisticated prey. But the most elegant aspect of your campaign was psychological rather than technical. You understood that the most effective way to destroy investigative journalism was not through direct censorship, but through systematic manipulation that would make the journalists destroy themselves. He gestured around the room. Each participant was carefully selected and precisely manipulated. Mr. Baird was chosen because his financial vulnerabilities made him susceptible to pressure. Miss Ziegler was targeted because her fiduciary obligations could be weaponized to justify editorial interference. Mr. Vance was manipulated through his desperation, making him a willing participant in revealing his organization's vulnerabilities to someone he believed could save it. Troy's professional composure finally showed cracks. The methodology was sound, she said, her voice carrying a note of professional pride. Investigative journalism depends on public trust, institutional independence, and editorial integrity. Corrupt any of those elements systematically, and the entire structure collapses. The moral accounting. Wolfe's expression shifted from intellectual satisfaction to moral judgment. You corrupted the very concept of truth that journalism is meant to serve. You transformed institutional loyalty into betrayal, professional obligation into criminal conspiracy, and editorial independence into systematic manipulation. I demonstrated that those concepts are more fragile than their defenders want to admit. Troy replied, investigative journalism exists only because powerful interests allow it to exist. When those interests decide it has become inconvenient, it can be eliminated with surgical precision. Perhaps, Wolfe said quietly. But you failed to account for one variable in your systematic manipulation. Which was? The possibility that someone might care more about truth than about institutional survival, more about justice than about professional advancement, and more about moral principle than about strategic advantage. The final justice. The phone rang with the punctuality of fate keeping an appointment. I answered to find Inspector Kramer's voice, carrying the satisfaction of a man whose arrest warrants had finally been signed by a federal judge. They're on their way up, he reported. Federal charges for conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. The evidence package you provided convinced the grand jury that this was systematic institutional corruption rather than isolated criminal activity. As federal agents entered to take Troy into custody, she maintained her professional dignity with the composure of someone who'd been caught in a sophisticated game, but wasn't ashamed of having played it expertly. "Mr. Wolfe," she said as handcuffs were applied, "you've won this particular engagement, but the methodology remains sound. Investigative journalism will continue to be vulnerable to systematic attack by people with sufficient resources and strategic intelligence." "Perhaps," Wolfe replied, "but it will also continue to be defended by people who understand that truth, properly applied, is more powerful than any conspiracy designed to suppress it." The restoration of order. As the federal agents led Troy away and the other participants filed out to face their own legal reckonings, the office gradually returned to its proper proportions. Delia Ziegler and Marcus Webb departed with the controlled urgency of people calculating institutional damage. Carlton Baird left with his federal escort, his cooperation having earned him consideration, but not absolution. Owen Vance lingered, his face carrying the complex expression of someone who'd achieved his goal through methods that had required sacrificing his own moral certainty. "Mr. Wolfe," he said quietly, "I manipulated you into this case. I used your intellectual pride and your sense of justice to serve my agenda. That makes me complicit in the deception, even if my ultimate goal was exposure of the truth." "Mr. Vance," Wolfe replied, "you orchestrated circumstances to ensure that truth would prevail over institutional corruption. Your methods were manipulative, but your objective was justice. The distinction matters, though it does not absolve you of the ethical compromises you made." As Vance departed, Vera Conti approached with the determined expression of someone prepared to rebuild from ruins. "We'll continue publishing," she announced, "if we can maintain funding and credibility after this exposure." "You can," Wolfe said with certainty. "Truth properly defended creates its own institutional strength, but you must remain vigilant against the corruption that masquerades as pragmatic compromise." The philosophical reflection. Fritz appeared to announce that dinner would be served in 20 minutes, and Wolfe nodded his approval. The brownstone sanctuary had been restored, its domestic order re-established, and its moral authority vindicated through the proper application of intellectual force. "The truth, Archie, was indeed hiding in plain sight," Wolfe observed as he closed his evening paper. "But it required systematic investigation to reveal that what appeared to be simple sabotage was actually sophisticated institutional warfare, conducted by people who understood that the most effective way to destroy truth is to make its defenders destroy themselves." I poured myself a drink and reflected on the elegant precision of Wolfe's intellectual combat. He had not merely solved a case of institutional corruption. He had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated manipulation could not withstand the focused application of logic, evidence, and moral authority properly directed. The case was closed. Justice would follow with the precision of natural law. And plain, Sight magazine would continue its mission with renewed understanding of both its importance and its vulnerability to those who would corrupt truth for institutional advantage. The brownstone had weathered another assault on the natural order of things, and Nero Wolfe had once again proven that intellectual integrity, properly applied, could restore justice even to the most corrupted institutions. By Monday morning, the brownstone had stopped vibrating. That's the only way I can describe what happens when a case runs hot enough to shake the foundations of institutional order and then suddenly resolves itself through the proper application of superior intelligence. The house settles back into its natural rhythms like a symphony orchestra, finding its tempo after a particularly challenging passage. Fritz emerged from his kitchen at 8:30 with the expression of a man whose cathedral had been cleansed of vandals and restored to proper worship. The saffron was back in its rightful place between the cumin and cardamom. The olive oil inventory had been reconciled with forensic precision, and the natural order of spices had been restored through what he considered the most civilized form of justice: the defeat of those who would trespass against the sacred protocols of culinary excellence. "Order," he announced, polishing a copper pot with the satisfaction of a priest blessing a relic, "is not merely the absence of chaos. It is the presence of proper understanding." The legal reckoning. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 11 o'clock, moving with the deliberate satisfaction of a man whose intellectual combat had achieved its intended objectives. The morning papers were spread across his desk like battle reports from a war won through strategic superiority rather than brute force. Nathaniel Parker arrived at 11:15 with news that carried the weight of institutional justice properly applied. "The federal charges are comprehensive and devastating," he reported, settling into the red leather chair with evident satisfaction. "Renata Troy faces 15 counts including conspiracy, wire fraud, and civil rights violations under color of authority. The evidence of systematic manipulation convinced the grand jury that this was organized criminal enterprise disguised as institutional oversight." "And the others?" I asked, pouring coffee that Fritz had prepared with the precision of a chemist balancing molecular formulas. "Delia Ziegler and Marcus Webb are cooperating fully with federal investigators in exchange for consideration on charges. The Amaranth Trust's board has initiated emergency restructuring to eliminate conflicts of interest and restore what they're calling fiduciary integrity, though I suspect they mean legal defensibility. Carlton Baird's cooperation has earned him a plea agreement, but his legal career is finished." Wolfe made a sound that might have been satisfaction or the recognition that justice, while inevitable, often arrives wearing work clothes rather than formal attire. "The institutional response? Swift and comprehensive," Parker replied. "The Trust has established new oversight procedures designed to prevent the conflicts of interest that enabled Ms. Troy's manipulation. They're also creating an investigative journalism defense fund to support organizations facing similar attacks." The editorial resurrection, Owen Vance arrived at noon, carrying the first issue of Plain Sight to be published since the conspiracy's exposure. The cover story, written by Miriam Lyle with the thoroughness of a reporter who'd finally gotten access to the biggest story of her career, was titled "How We Were Manipulated," an inside account of systematic institutional warfare. "We're calling it our Truth and Reconciliation issue," Vance explained, his voice carrying the complex mixture of professional pride and personal humility that comes from surviving institutional near-death through the intervention of superior intelligence. Complete disclosure of how the conspiracy operated, full documentation of our security failures, and a commitment to transparency that should make future manipulation considerably more difficult. The magazine had been transformed by its ordeal. Vera Conte's editorial carried the authority of someone who'd watched her life's work nearly destroyed by sophisticated sabotage, and emerged with clearer understanding of both journalism's importance and its vulnerability. Franklin Wheat had prepared a financial supplement that documented every aspect of the Trust's funding with the precision of an accountant whose careful records had been weaponized against him and who was determined never to be caught unprepared again. "The circulation has actually increased," Vance reported with the wonder of someone discovering that institutional integrity, properly defended, creates its own market value. Apparently, readers appreciate transparency about our own vulnerabilities more than they appreciated our previous assumption of invulnerability. The technical fortress, Leo Kim, had spent the week implementing security measures that would make future infiltration require considerably more sophisticated resources than corporate intelligence firms typically deploy against quarterly magazines. The server room had been rebuilt with enterprise-grade equipment. Access controls had been redesigned around zero-trust principles, and monitoring systems had been installed that would detect unauthorized access attempts with the efficiency of a burglar alarm designed by paranoid geniuses. We've also established relationships with cybersecurity firms that specialize in protecting investigative journalism, Leo reported with the satisfaction of someone whose professional expertise had been vindicated through crisis. The methodology used against us is sophisticated but not unique. Other organizations have faced similar attacks, and we're sharing intelligence to develop defensive strategies. The technical reforms extended beyond simple security. Editorial workflows had been compartmentalized to limit damage from future infiltration. Source protection protocols had been strengthened with multiple redundancies, and backup systems had been distributed across secure locations that would require federal warrants to access. The human cost and recovery. Not everyone emerged from the conspiracy with their professional lives intact. Carlton Baird's legal career was finished, his cooperation with federal prosecutors having earned him consideration for reduced charges, but not professional redemption. He'd accepted a position with a non-profit legal clinic, his expertise in media law being redirected toward protecting press freedom rather than exploiting its vulnerabilities. The sources whose identities had been compromised were receiving protective support, but several had suffered professional retaliation that would take years to overcome. The Parks Department bookkeeper who'd provided the original documents had been reinstated after federal intervention, but his courage in exposing corruption had cost him friendships and professional relationships that might never be restored. The price of truth, Wolfe observed, reviewing reports on the human cost of institutional warfare, is paid not only by its defenders, but by those who choose to speak it when speaking requires courage. The broader web. The conspiracy's exposure had triggered investigations that revealed a pattern of attacks on investigative journalism across the country. Congressional hearings were examining the use of corporate intelligence firms to suppress press freedom. The Department of Justice had announced a task force focused on protecting First Amendment rights from systematic institutional manipulation. Miriam Lyle's follow-up investigation, already in progress, was examining the network of corporate intelligence firms, real estate development companies, and charitable organizations that had been identified in the federal investigation. Her preliminary findings suggested that the methodology used against Plain Sight was part of a coordinated campaign by entities with substantial resources and strategic intelligence capabilities. At least 6 other publications have faced similar attacks over the past 2 years. She reported with the grim satisfaction of a reporter who'd uncovered a story that kept expanding. The sophistication suggests systematic institutional warfare rather than isolated incidents of corporate misconduct. The domestic restoration. Fritz appeared at the office door at 6:30 with the expression of a man whose cathedral was ready to celebrate the defeat of those who had dared to violate its sanctuary. "Dinner will be served at 7, he announced with ceremonial precision. "Tonight we dine as civilized men whose domestic order has been restored through the proper application of intellectual force." The menu was his, masterpiece of restorative cooking. Beef bourguignon prepared with his finest burgundy, roasted root vegetables that had been selected with the care of a botanist, choosing specimens, and a salad of wintergreens that argued for the superiority of natural order over artificial manipulation. "The saffron remains undisturbed," Fritz reported with satisfaction. "The olive oil is properly inventoried. And I have prepared a meal worthy of men who understand that institutional integrity begins with respect for the proper order of things." The philosophical accounting. We dined in the dining room with the French doors open to the back garden, where the fountain had resumed its proper murmur, and the city's noise was filtered through the natural acoustics of domestic tranquility. The beef bourguignon made an argument for patience and proper technique, while the wine provided counterpoint to the day's harsh realities. Over coffee, Guatemala, because nuance after comfort represents civilized progression, Wolfe addressed the case's broader implications with the satisfaction of a man whose intellectual combat had achieved objectives beyond the immediate resolution of institutional corruption. The conspiracy succeeded partially, Archie, he observed, setting down his cup with the precision of a man who had no use for unnecessary noise. It demonstrated that investigative journalism is indeed vulnerable to systematic attack by people with sufficient resources and strategic intelligence. But it also demonstrated that such attacks can be defeated when truth is defended with equal sophistication and superior moral authority. And the lesson for future defenders of institutional integrity: vigilance without paranoia, skepticism without cynicism, and the understanding that truth, properly applied, creates its own institutional strength. He paused, his eyes moving to the window where the city lights suggested the ongoing complexity of human affairs. But perhaps most importantly, the recognition that the most dangerous enemies of truth are not those who oppose it directly, but those who corrupt it from within while claiming to serve its interests. He leaned back in his chair, his expression carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. The human appetite for power, for control, for the comfortable illusion of righteousness. These drives men to construct elaborate justifications for betraying the very principles they claim to defend. Mr. Baird convinced himself he was minimizing damage. Miss Ziegler persuaded herself she was protecting institutional integrity. Miss Troy believed her superior intellect justified systematic manipulation. And Vance. Mr. Vance demonstrated that desperation and manipulation are not mutually exclusive. He wished to save his magazine through strategic revelation of his enemy's crimes, but he was willing to manipulate our engagement to ensure the desired outcome. Wolfe's slight smile suggested professional appreciation for sophisticated strategy. His methods were ethically questionable, but his objective was just. The distinction matters, though it does not absolve him of the moral compromises he made. The final quiet. As we moved back to the office, Fritz had restored the room to its proper proportions with the special attention he reserved for spaces that had witnessed the triumph of institutional order over systematic corruption. The Persian rug lay square, the photograph had been returned to its proper place, and the blue index card with its 7 names rested under the paperweight, evidence that had served its purpose and could now be filed among the mementos of justice properly applied. I cleared my desk of the case materials, wrote "Closed Federal Prosecution" at the top of the file, and slid the folder into its designated place. The drawer shut with the clean sound of institutional order restored through intellectual combat. This one went the way they're supposed to, I observed. Truth exposed, justice served, institutional integrity restored, and dinner at 7. Wolfe had opened a book that wasn't about orchids, but contained the kind of philosophical reflection he claimed to disdain, but secretly valued. The absence of corpses does not diminish the gravity of institutional corruption, Archie. It merely changes the nature of the damage and the methods required for restoration. He looked up from his reading with the expression of a man whose intellectual combat had achieved its intended objectives. We are not merely detectives. We are gardeners of institutional integrity, removing what chokes the roots of truth and justice. That's going in the permanent file, I told him, under Wolfe, surprisingly poetic. Phui. He returned to his book with the satisfaction of a man whose domestic sanctuary had been restored and whose intellectual authority had been vindicated through the proper application of superior intelligence to institutional corruption. The brownstone settled into its evening quiet, having weathered another assault on the natural order of things. Outside, the city continued its complex dance of human ambition and institutional failure, but inside our sanctuary, truth had been defended, justice had been served, and Fritz's saffron remained exactly where it belonged. If there's a better ending than a quiet room, a satisfied mind, and the knowledge that institutional integrity can be restored through the proper application of intellectual force, I haven't discovered it. And if I ever get the urge to test someone's domestic security by rearranging their spice rack, I'll remember that some sanctuaries are defended by minds that don't forgive trespass against the natural order of truth. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure. In a world where institutional corruption masqueraded as pragmatic compromise, the brownstone remained a fortress where truth could be defended through the superior application of logic, evidence, and moral authority that refused to accept convenient rationalizations for systematic betrayal. The fountain murmured in the garden, Fritz hummed in his kitchen, and Nero Wolfe read his philosophy while the city settled into another night of complex human affairs. Some truths, once revealed, create their own protection, and some sanctuaries, once defended, become stronger for having survived the test.